From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
It imposes all these just terrible, really dangerous rules and mandates on the states that would get rid of every single security or safety protocol that states have in place.
This is your host, Scott Bertram, and that's Hans von Spakovsky, Senior Legal Fellow with the Heritage Foundation. We'll talk with him a little bit later on in today's program as we dive into H.R. 1, the election reform bill, currently being debated in the United States Senate. Up first, Dr. Matthew Meehan, Director of Academic Programs for Hillsdale in D.C. and Assistant Professor of Government. Dr. Meehan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
You know, who says Twitter is worthless? I saw you tweet a few times on a singular topic over the past few months and thought it would make a really good topic for our conversation. And to put it as succinct as possible, we'll call this good poetics and good politics and how they relate. Where do you begin to draw this connection between poetics and politics?
Probably not from Twitter, I suppose would be the short answer. But yeah, so, I mean, in terms of where we draw it from in the sort of Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman tradition of the West, this is a conversation that you could say started with Socrates in Plato's Republic, the poets and the philosophers, right? And there's this sort of fight between them. Socrates wants to kick the poet out of the beautiful city, but in his arguments, he's constantly quoting Homer, and you can see he's got a big debt to Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey. And you get to this sort of question of what's the role of poetry in the city. And Socrates says it's so powerful and so profound that, gosh darn it, we probably should just kick the poets out. So that, from the very get-go of the tradition, there's been this question, and from the Judeo-Christian perspective, you can think of Christianity's relationship to civil society, and you can consider that Genesis offers several accounts of the creation of the world and uses a lot of sort of beautiful imagery and is what's known somewhat impiously as the true myth, right? Not a false myth, but it's the story of our origins, told in multiple ways, to help us understand the nature of God, the nature of creation, the nature of man. So these kinds of poetic instruments, the written word, communication, images, ideas are fundamental to civil society in a way.
Why does our treatment of words and texts influence how we treat laws and how we treat each other?
Yeah, so you can take this, it's a great question. You can kind of take it in two different ways, I think, that might be useful. One is in that, right, how we treat texts oftentimes is a kind of stalking horse or a practice round for how we wind up treating our fellow man and how we wind up treating our city, our laws, and various other artifacts, if you want, out there in the real world. So if you read a text and you treat it willfully and you beat up on it and you just interpret it like, I'm going to read Alice in Wonderland and I'm going to look for its various anti-patriarchal, transgender, Marxist capital indictments. You're like, okay, you're not paying attention to this text. You're just forcing whatever ideological concerns you have upon this thing. You're not trying to learn from it, listen, engage it, benefit from it, absorb it. You're trying to use it. And so there's a certain kind of habit of tyrannizing over text that can lead to a tyrannizing over other people and the political community. And you can inhabit, like we talk about, a constitution that is something, right, that means something. And you can have a living constitution, which basically means, I get to sort of inhabit these various laws and constitutional documents and institutions with whatever zeitgeist of the moment I want. So I force something upon the political community. So that sort of being open to reality and open to, frankly, rule of law, open to equality, open to friendship.
So that's one way, Dr. Meehan. What's the other way, in your opinion, that our treatment of texts and words can influence our relationships and the law?
I think it's the actual, not just the process, but the content, right? Good books, wonderful, texts that humanize us, that teach us what it means to be human, that both sort of stimulate the mind to think in a principled way, either tragedy, oops, that's bad, maybe there's better principles than these people operated under, or comedy, like, we're not perfect, but we work our way towards good action and right principle. Those kinds of things wind up both informing the mind and the heart, and teach us, how to be with one another. And all of those could be summed up in a kind of what I'd say is a sort of rhetoric of friendship, where you learn how to move the heart and the mind of other people in a way that is fair and just by being moved yourself in a way that is fair and just, assuming you pick good books and not abusive ideological books to engage. Or if you have to engage those books, you do it with a jaundiced eye and you're careful.
Talking with Dr. Matt Meehan from Hillsdale in D.C., Director of Academic Programs there, on good poetics and good politics. In what ways does our civic life require that we are wise people informed by poetics?
Yeah, right. In many ways. I think so Thales, one of the ancient Greek sophists, has this line, right? Tell me who a city's poets are, and I care not who make its laws. That's overstatement and ridiculous, and you get this sort of politics is downstream from culture. That's only half true, right? Because politics can be upstream of culture too. You pass a law, and it teaches and informs. Mm-hmm. But either which way, be it culture or politics, the means by which it influences one or the other, right, is through these teaching functions. The way the law and its enforcement, its communications, the way the stories and the images and the narratives, if you want to put it in modern terms, right, these sorts of things wind up informing human action. Either which way, it's informing human action. So civic life is going to require people to have a good civic education and understand how politics works, but also understand how poetics work, how images work, how the cultural side of things is used and sometimes manipulated. That was Socrates' big concern in the Republic. Like, he was very concerned that people were not aware when major changes were being effected through erroneous poetics that were, informing and creating a new way of life. Oftentimes, I think people who care about justice, goodness, truth, beauty, and the American way, like, they oftentimes will leave off this poetic side of things, and you look today at some of the stories being told on Netflix or Amazon Prime series, and you can see a basically acid bath of images that are really eroding a lot of these powerful truths. And so wise civic leaders, citizens, right, will need to be very wary about which stories, what art, which images, what kind of poetry, right, what stories are being told to the next generation in particular, but even to themselves, sort of wearing them down. I often dog some of my dear friends who got into Game of Thrones, which, I refuse to watch on various principled grounds. But one of the least principled, or the more complicatedly principled ones, was, you guys, you can't just watch people dying and murdering each other in, lascivious leotards and, dragon fire. Like, that's going to make you dark and pessimistic, and it'll actually dim your heart. And I would recommend that wise civic leaders and serious citizens are going to guard their minds and steel themselves with virtue, but also be careful to guard their hearts and their affections.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what words are told to you. And then once you become savvy to that, then you can also become more savvy about what words are told to you by you. What do you tell yourself? Because you are, in a certain sense, your own poet. And that's that kind of that rhetoric of liberty that you have to get into, both for self-governance personally and self-government on the civic level.
We'll pause right there for a moment. Dr. Matt Meehan from Hillsdale in D.C. talking about good poetics and good politics. I'm Scott Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scott Bertram. We've been talking with Dr. Matt Meehan from Hillsdale in D.C. He's Director of Academic Programs there and Assistant Professor of Government about good poetics and good politics. How do good poetics improve the art of friendship?
So, insofar as you learn about the human heart, you learn about tragedy, and you learn about the use of beautiful language to move the human heart, you're basically getting a kind of primer on loving other people in a humane way and communicating with them in a way that doesn't just get the facts out there, but also considers their feelings and how to move their heart in the right direction. That is to say, I have a lot of respect for Ben Shapiro and people at the Daily Signal and other places, but the facts don't care about your feelings is true, but also irrelevant if you're trying to get your friend to embrace certain facts, right? Like, you have to consider their heart. Where are they? How do you move them towards the truth? And, that's a real art, but it's an art of images and words and persuasion, and not just appealing to their intellect, but also appealing to their heart. And that's, the heartstrings, that's the instrument of the poet. And so if you don't have good poetics and you don't think about this, you're going to be a less effective friend in helping your friends towards virtue, right action, happiness, and joy.
And I've seen you speak on this a little bit. Something that stuck with me was your description of also that this helps us remain calm and helps us remain peaceful in our debates and discussions about civics.
Yeah, no, that's right. There's a certain kind of when poetics features as a serious part of your thinking, the heart features in sort of equal parts with the mind. And so there's not just the insistence on being right, but there's the insistence on making sure that the rightness is being couched in the way that's most aimed to help others and affect the goals you have. But there's also this idea of, good rhetoric can be fiery and strong in opposition to enemies and evils, but it's also very strong in providing calm, right? That's people forget. Aristotle in the Rhetoric talks about calm is an emotion, right? To be able to inspire calm is the number one emotion to bring certain amounts of reason into the mind, right? So that's part of it in one sense. But then you need to then cinch it up and help embrace that idea with various other emotions of, righteous anger, properly understood, and usually less than people often argue, but also a certain love of the beautiful and the good, joy, even laughter. There's this kind of Republican wit that follows out from, I'm not just communicating truth, I'm communicating truth in a civic way, a civil way. Kiwis, citizens, from Poles, we're friends in politics. That's the basis for civics, is equality of friendship, right, in the civic realm. So I think that's one part of it. And then the other one is kind of what I referenced earlier with regard to you become more attentive to how to manage your own emotions, right? I feel like Twitter is this kind of Pavlovian I can't even machine where people just continue to foster disgust for different things. Mm-hmm. And I always sort of laugh when people are like, I can't even deal with X, you name it. It could be, a policy issue, a pundit, a president, whatever it is, right? And you go like, well, maybe you shouldn't look at that as much as you do, right? Like, maybe you should be concerned not to totally ruin your heart with revulsion over and over again over the worst parts of something, because then you can't think clearly, right? So there's all these different aspects and plenty of others, but that's the beginning of an answer.
And then how can poetics help us discuss and explain these complex truths in our world?
Yeah, so in a certain sense, poetry, a serious study and practice of poetry will give you the confidence to understand that certain complex truths can actually be communicated successfully in image, right? For all of Socrates' hemming and hawing about Homer, he ends with the myth of in Book 10 of the Republic, and Plato decides to create an image of Socrates in argument and write a bunch of imagistic dialogues about Socrates, right? So you start to realize that simpler images can bring forth very complex truths, but they have to be done just right. And it's about fashioning the right kind of image that faithfully and truly relates real truth and real principle. So the more adept you become at that kind of art, the more likely you are to be able to bring complex civic truths to your fellow citizens, both in debate, but also in education, and just in the general shared joy of being a part of a community. And you'll be able to do that more effectively. And, on a more practical level, I think, frankly, if more people studied this, they'd be more attentive to making sure that the images were there to help people along towards these things. I think there's oftentimes an overemphasis on, I made a really good argument. I was like, yeah, but did you see the stage you were on? It looked really clunky, and your suit was ill-fitting, and you used, like, 2 random references that people didn't understand, and you made them laugh at the wrong place. And, the background was this weird laser light and a star as opposed to a beautiful image of the country. Like, you could see Kanye West's presidential ads were like, cameras firing across open sunlit water to some new clean future, right? Now, Kanye is probably all poet and no philosopher in a certain sense, or not enough philosopher. No offense, Kanye, if you're listening, I'd love to help you out. But nevertheless, he has a really strong artistic sense about communicating what he wanted to communicate. And Team Good Guy, as I like to refer to us, oftentimes errs on the other side of getting a lot of principles down, but not thinking about the images that would communicate them quickly and successfully.
Talking with Dr. Matt Meehan from Hillsdale in D.C. about good poetics and good politics. Final question for you, Dr. Meehan. Now, having said all this, can good poetics, can this Republican wit that you mentioned previously help make us better citizens?
I think in one sense the answer is no, only if we use it with an intention for good, right? It's a neutral. It's an instrument, right? Can a baseball bat help you in home defense? Well, if you have no upper body strength, right, and are uncoordinated, and the bat's in the garage, then no, it can't. But it certainly can help you become a better citizen as an instrument in your hands. And with regard to that question of Republican wit, I mean, a lot of the other, I'd be repeating myself if I kind of went through some of the things that I think are obviously helpful for citizenship that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
But there's another one, this understanding of Republican wit for the American experience is very interesting in that one of the things that poetry teaches you, it's oftentimes called an education in wit, right? How to use images and see things from different perspectives and analogously, right? Not just hear arguments, but sort of pivot and have nimbleness of mind. Part of it is, right, it's the art of laughter and humor. And humor has a couple different advantages in a republic, and a democratic one to boot. One, it inspires equality, right? You can mock people who get too high. Now, you can do that vituperously and meanly, and that's a lesser good or a mixed, a lesser of two evils, right? But it does bring people low through vituperative mockery, right? Like see stand-up comedy, right? That brings, people who have tyrannical ambitions low. But it can also bring someone low by getting them to laugh at themselves, right? And not take themselves too seriously in the wrong way. And that's a huge part of getting justice without falling to riot, mob, war, the breaking of friendships, right? It's getting someone to laugh at their position. It's a real art. It's quite difficult. It takes training. It used to be a kind of training we would give people, even the high school and the collegiate level. Hillsdale's doing some of that. Some of our schools are doing some of that. I think we can certainly keep improving, as we all know. But that kind of Republican wit strengthens equality, right? And that strengthens friendship, but also it diffuses anger while still handling questions of justice. And that kind of wit is in short supply today, and I think it would help us be better citizens.
Dr. Matthew Meehan, Director of Academic Programs for Hillsdale in D.C., Assistant Professor of Government, talking about good poetics and good politics. Dr. Meehan, thanks so much for joining us on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you, Scott.
Up next, we'll talk with Hans von Spakovsky from the Heritage Foundation about H.R. 1, that election reform bill now being debated in the U.S. Senate. I'm Scott Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scott Bertram. You can get an email every time there's a new episode of this program. Head to radiohour.hillsdale.edu and enter your email address, radiohour.hillsdale.edu. We're joined now by Hans von Spakovsky. He's manager of Election Law Reform Initiative and senior legal fellow, the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation, heritage.org. Hans, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure, thanks for having me.
We talked today about H.R. 1, the election bill that is currently making its way through the Senate after having passed the House. Democrats call it For the People Act. Before we get into the details, Hans, you have to tell us, how can you be opposed, and what's so dangerous about this voting rights bill? He asked, tongue planted firmly in cheek.
Well, actually, they ought to rename it For the Fraudsters Act, because that's what this does. It's in essence a federal takeover of the administration of elections, taking it away from states. And it imposes all these just terrible, really dangerous rules and mandates on the states that would get rid of every single security or safety protocol that states have in place. I mean, just a quick example of it is if you're a state that's been smart enough to put in a voter ID requirement, that would no longer be enforceable. No state could enforce a voter ID law, and that's just one of many bad provisions in H.R. 1.
And that voter ID provision specifically, Hans, this is an issue that you go back years, heck, even more than a decade. I know I've been talking with you. Voter ID is an extremely popular measure. In many polls, 65%, 75%. In some polls, even a majority of Democrats support voter ID laws. This bill would eliminate them across the country.
No, that's exactly right. And this is one of those areas where the constituents of the Democratic Party do not agree with their leadership, because this is a party line issue. H.R. 1 was passed in the U.S. House on a party line vote. It's now in the Senate, and it has so many provisions in it that just defy common sense. And the polling shows the American people do not like its provisions, like banning voter ID laws.
Another provision in H.R. 1, Hans, is universal automatic voter registration. Why is that not the best idea?
Well, because what it would require states to do is to register to vote without asking them first. Individuals in their states who have dealings with state agencies. So if you have multiple dealings with multiple state agencies, like the DMV to get a driver's license, perhaps a state unemployment office to get unemployment benefits, all of those offices are going to be sending your information to get registered, and it's no doubt going to lead to multiple registrations of the same person. Also, many individuals dealing with state agencies like that are not U.S. citizens, and it's highly likely that they are also going to get registered. And add on top of that, it doesn't just apply to state agencies having to automatically register people. It also applies to federal agencies. So federal agencies are going to have to figure out, well, who in their records is a resident of which state, and then they have to send that information. So that's going to lead to people being registered in multiple states. So it's just going to make our voter registration rolls even worse than they already are.
And Hans, talking H.R. 1 with Hans von Spakovsky here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. The concept of ballot harvesting, people might have heard the phrase when it came to this past presidential election. It's legal in some places, not allowed in other places. Give us a little definition about ballot harvesting and what would H.R. 1 do about it?
Yeah, look, in every state, you can mail back your absentee ballot if you're going to vote that way. You can hand deliver it. A member of your family can hand deliver it. In most states, a designated caregiver can hand deliver it. But in most states, they have banned third-party strangers from delivering your absentee ballot. That's again, common sense requirement, because you don't want candidates and campaign staffers, party activists, and political consultants to be able to get their hands on your absentee ballot, because they could potentially alter it, change it. They might not deliver it if they know you vote for candidates of the other party. Plus, it puts them in the position of showing up at the front doors of people in their homes, voters, where they could coerce and pressure voters. So many states, like North Carolina, for example, ban it. This provision would override all of those state laws and require states to allow vote harvesting by third-party strangers. Again, this is just a reckless change in the law if this bill passed the Senate and was signed by President Biden.
What does H.R. 1 say, Hans, about disclosure provisions? We have seen supporters being targeted when some of their donations have been made public, even recently some donations that have been leaked. People have been targeted for making various donations to political entities. What does H.R. 1 say about the ability to do that with some level of privacy?
Yeah, we've been concentrating on the administration provisions, but this is a 900-page bill. It has a whole section changing federal campaign finance laws. And look, nobody disputes the fact that we should have disclosure of donations to political candidates and to political action committees. But this bill would extend the disclosure requirements to all kinds of nonprofit associations that don't spend 100% of their time on politics at all. And, of course, the problem with that is that this is intended, it's very clear, this is intended to force those organizations to disclose their donors and their members so that they will be subject to harassment and intimidation, and to dry up resources for organizations that the left does not like because of its stance on issues, not because they participate in political campaigns, but because they may be, for example, pro-Second Amendment and anti-abortion.
Hans von Spakovsky with us, Heritage Foundation, heritage.org, as we talk the provisions inside H.R. 1. H.R. 1 also would set up a public funding program for candidates running for Congress. So you, in effect, have congressional members in the House and in the Senate voting to force the public to fund their own campaigns through H.R. 1.
Yeah, that's really one of the most outrageous parts of the bill is this public funding program. And by the way, there was a single Democrat who actually crossed party lines to vote against H.R. 1 when it was being considered in the House, and he, in fact, cited that very provision for the reason that he voted against it, because he said his constituents did not want to be put in the position of having their taxpayer funds subsidizing the campaigns of candidates who they didn't like, didn't agree with, and would never vote for in a million years.
Hans, you can read more about this bill from Hans over at heritage.org and over at dailysignal.com. Two big picture questions I wanted to ask about H.R. 1. We know it's made it through the House, and as we mentioned, talk this week in the Senate as well. Is this a bill on which Democrats might be forced to consider the filibuster or eliminating the filibuster to pass?
Yeah. I think that's very much potentially the case, and that seems to be the avenue for Republicans to prevent this bill from going through, is to filibuster the bill. And for folks who don't understand that, what we're talking about with the filibusters, remember, you can't vote on whether to pass a bill until debate on the bill has ended. And in the Congress, it takes 60 votes to end debate. And by ending the filibuster rule, then they could easily end debate with a 51-vote majority and then vote to pass the bill.
And Hans, we see some states acting, right? Georgia, of course, Arizona, Florida,
right,
to pass some election reform bills into law. What should individual states be doing on this matter that might be a whole heck of a lot better than H.R. 1?
Florida and Georgia have, for example, passed very comprehensive election reform bills. And those bills, despite all the unfair criticisms of them, are actually good bills. They do things like, in Georgia, extending Georgia's voter ID requirement to absentee ballots, which is something they ought to do. They have banned private funding of election officials, something that happened in the last election and frankly, may have potentially changed the outcome by providing unequal opportunities to vote in urban areas versus more rural areas. And they've done a whole series of steps like that to just fix basic vulnerabilities in the system. But both the Florida law and the Georgia law are good examples for other states of what they ought to be doing to ensure the fairness and security of their elections.
Hans von Spakovsky, manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative and senior legal fellow at the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation, heritage.org, to read more. Hans, thanks for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Up next, Dwight Lindley from Hillsdale's English Department returns for his occasional series on Victorian poetry. Today we talk Robert Browning. I'm Scott Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scott Bertram. For more information about Hillsdale College for prospective students, for friends of Hillsdale, or for alumni, head to hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Dr. Dwight Lindley, Associate Professor of English here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Lindley, thanks for joining us.
Thanks again, Scott.
We return with our occasional series on Victorian poetry here on the program, and today we talk about Robert Browning. What should we know about Robert Browning as we begin to discuss him?
That's a good question. So Robert Browning, unlike Alfred Lord Tennyson, whom we mentioned in an earlier series, in an earlier program, was a little bit more of a fringe character in his time. He wasn't from the Anglican establishment religiously, as Tennyson was. He didn't go to the university, partially for that reason. You know, in the religious culture of that day, you had the establishment, which were the Anglicans, and then you had the dissenters, who were Protestants who didn't want to be Anglican. You Methodists, Baptists, and other kinds of evangelicals, we could group amongst them. And he grew up in that set. And so his parents were well-to-do. He was well-educated, but all at home and by tutors, private tutors, didn't go to university. And so he was a little bit of an outsider culturally in a way that Alfred Lord Tennyson, say, wasn't. That's one bit of background. Another bit of background I think is important is he lived a lot overseas. He spent a lot of his life in Italy, actually. A lot of his poems are set there. And he famously married the poetess, the female poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who at the time was more famous than he was. He was really marrying up in terms of literary reputation. I would say since then, since the end of their lives, his poetry has actually been more prominent than hers. But at the time, they were, a famously married set of literary celebrities.
So as we look at some of the works of Robert Browning, what are some of the themes that we discover in his work?
Well, so I think the funny thing about his themes, they all center around the peculiarity and mystery of life. And let me explain what I mean. He had a view of life that it's in the smallest elements of our lives, the smallest details of our lives that we are really revealed. In these littlest things that only the people who know you best may catch about you. And these are the things that we commonly miss about one another. We pass each other like ships, ships in the night. And as in our own world today, 21st century, so in the Victorian period, you had massive metropolises like London, where Browning lived much of his life, where a lot of people were Johnny-come-latelys. They hadn't grown up there. They had moved in from here and there, hither and yon. And so you had a lot of anonymity, like you do in the contemporary city. And he thought with his poetry, he wanted to try to notice little things about others and about lives that could mysteriously open up the depth dimension of people. And I just wanted to read a bit of, there's a famous poem of his called Fra Lippo Lippi. That means Brother Lippo Lippi, who is a famous Renaissance Italian painter. Filippo Lippi. If you go to Florence today, you can see his paintings there. Well, Browning imagines himself within this guy's life from 500 years ago, and thinks about his own poetic art by analogy with this guy's paintings. So he has this fellow say, and this really speaks for Browning and his own art. He says, in your art, in your poetry, count it a crime to let a truth slip. And so he's trying to notice everything and not to let anything slip by. And then he says, for don't you mark, we're made so that we love first when we see them painted, when we see other people painted or caught in art. Things we have passed perhaps 100 times nor cared to see, and so they are better painted, better to us, which is the same thing. Art was given for that. God uses us to help each other so, lending our minds out. And that's the end of the quote. So what he's saying there is, when a Renaissance painter, or when a poet, when an artist tries to capture somebody else in the details and the concreteness of their life, the gift there, if it's good art, it's going to open that person up in a way that you might, in a way that you wouldn't get normally, right? To show you things that you would pass by without seeing. And he even goes beyond that and says, God lends our minds out to each other to do that. So it's interesting. He doesn't just think this happens in art. He thinks this happens in communication too. When you tell a story about someone, I may see something about that person that I've never seen before because of your angle and the thing that you noticed. Anyway, but that art is especially good at doing this, and poetry, as he's saying. So one of his themes that he's interested in is this human work of capturing the meaning and charge of a life in the little things that define that life. So that's one big thing, the kind of magic of the particular. Another thing we could point to that really defines his work is what I would call the ephemerality of society in contrast to romantic love. So on the first day when we talked about Victorian society as a background for poetry, notice we talked about how everybody's moving to the city, it's urbanization, big cities, and movement and excitement, and there's a lot happening. Well, this left a lot of people feeling alienated, as we still do, in modern urban culture, mass culture. Well, for Browning, one solution to that, or one response you could make to that is, well, you got to remember, society and politics, as important as they are, that's all kind of ephemeral and passing. And it's really not as important to us as these one-on-one relationships, especially romantic relationships we have with others. And there's a poem I just wanted to read a couple of lines from, which he called Love Among the Ruins. This was written in 1852, right in the middle of the century. And the striking thing about this poem is you've got a shepherd and a shepherdess, or a man and a woman, in the middle of fields that used to be the site of an ancient city that was glorious. And that city is now in ruins, and they are grazing their flocks there, and they're in love with one another. And it's clear the speaker in this poem is remembering the glories of that ancient city in all of its pomp and grandeur, and contrasting it over and over again with the very simple just togetherness that he has with this woman. And he says that compared to all of those centuries of folly, noise, and sin, he says, finally, what I have here is better. Love is best, is the way that he ends the poem. And this is a theme for him over and over again, is you're never going to find what you want in mass culture, which is very much what they had, just like we do. You're going to find it in smaller scale, one-on-one relationships, friendships of all kinds, but especially romantic. And this is one of his kind of responses to the day.
That's a fascinating theme to me. When he's writing, does he consider what he's doing something that might be talked about 170 years later, something that would be reevaluated and perhaps, again, as you mentioned earlier, maybe vaulted above the work of his wife in the future as well? Is he thinking he's creating these things that will last?
He's certainly trying to. I don't think that he was the kind of person who would aspired to be known better than his wife, which is not what you were saying. But I mean, he was humbler than that. But certainly he was trying to write timeless poetry, and poetry that would last. He loved the work of the poet Shelley, and there's a famous poem by Shelley called Ozymandias about how the work of the artist outlasts the work of the politician. And that's very much what Browning was going for. He was going for something that would outlast the particularities of his day and give people something to think about, something to work through and see the world through for centuries. Yeah.
Dr. Dwight Lindley, Associate Professor of English at Hillsdale College, on our Victorian Poetry Series and talking Robert Browning. Dr. Lindley, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Scott.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Matt Meehan from Hillsdale in D.C. talking good poetics and good politics. Hans von Spakovsky from the Heritage Foundation told us all about H.R. 1. And Dwight Lindley on Robert Browning. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, or Amazon Podcasts. Search for the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Follow the show on Twitter at Hillsdale Radio or over on Facebook. email us at radiohour@hillsdale.edu. Until next week, I'm Scott Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.